Big Shaq adopted 4 unwanted black kids when the world had given up on them. Years later, what Big Shaq's 4 unwanted black kids did broke millions of hearts across America. A story of pain, power, and a love so fierce, it shook the very ground they walked on. This isn't just Big Shaq's story. It's the story of a family the world never saw coming. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Even millions couldn't fill the hole Big Shaq felt every time he looked out over his endless estates. The sunlight slanted across the polished marble floors, catching the corners of gold-framed jerseys and championship rings encased like museum artifacts. His house could have been mistaken for a king's palace, yet every footstep echoed a little too sharply, like the walls were reminding him he was alone. Fame had never been the endgame for Shaquille O'Neal. It had chased him, clung to him, demanded things from him that sometimes he wasn't ready to give. Money, applause, media adoration, he had it all. But as he crossed another silent, pristine hallway, Shaq knew what he didn't have. Family. Not the kind that smiled for cameras, not the kind that cheered from polished front rows, the kind that messed up your kitchen at 2 a.m., the kind that fought over dumb things like who got the last slice of pizza, the kind that loved you, not your name. That afternoon, as the Florida sun melted into a sleepy haze, Shaq's driver asked if he wanted to take the long way back from a charity event. Without thinking, Shaq nodded. He leaned back in his custom SUV, windows tinted so dark it felt like a different world. It had been a good event. Sure, a few scholarships handed out, pictures taken, promises made, but good wasn't enough anymore. Something gnawed at him, something ugly and hollow that no standing ovation could fix. As the SUV weaved away from the gated communities and manicured golf courses, the scenery changed like flipping a channel. Crumbling sidewalks, rusted playgrounds, faded graffiti where hope used to live. Shaq peered out the window, one massive hand bracing against the glass like he could touch the sadness bleeding out of every cracked surface. They stopped at a red light, and that's when he saw them. 4 kids, sitting on a curb like leftover scraps. No parents in sight, no backpacks, no laughter. Just 4 tired, angry faces that didn't even bother pretending life was fair. Shaq's chest tightened in a way he hadn't felt since he was a boy himself, growing up under the heavy hand of poverty. He told the driver to circle the block again, and again. On the 3rd pass, the driver cleared his throat and asked if Shaq wanted him to stop. Shaq didn't answer. He was too busy staring into a mirror he hadn't realized was still hanging in his soul. Each of those kids looked like a story that hadn't been told yet. A story that too many people had already decided wasn't worth finishing. The youngest was barely 10. Kicking rocks in angry circles. The oldest, maybe 16, had that dangerous glint in his eye, the kind that comes from knowing nobody's coming for you. The 2 in between sat shoulder to shoulder, the way soldiers do in trenches when the war's gotten too loud to talk. Shaq didn't need to hear their stories to know the world had already thrown them away. Back home, he tried to shake the image. He cranked the volume on his stereo, tried to drown the silence in bass and beats. He swam laps in his Olympic-sized pool until his muscles screamed. He called up old friends, laughed at old jokes, pretended it was enough, but it wasn't. That night, as the moon hung fat and low over his backyard, Shaq found himself pacing circles across his sprawling kitchen. He could buy another car, another boat, another vacation home, in some glittering place, but it would be like pouring water into a bucket full of holes. It would never hold. The next morning he found himself dialing numbers he hadn't thought about in years. Old social workers, lawyers, community leaders. He didn't even know what he was asking for yet, only that he had to find those kids again. And when he did, he had to do something real. Not a photo op, not a check handed over with a smile and a handshake. Something that would cost him something. Maybe even everything. People told him he was crazy. Advisors warned him about the risks. You can't just take in street kids, Shaq, they said. They come with baggage, trauma, problems you can't solve with money. His accountant practically begged him to reconsider. Liability nightmare, he muttered. Bad press if it goes sideways. You've worked too hard to build your brand. Even some of his closest friends, guys who knew what it meant to grow up with nothing, shook their heads. Charity's one thing, man. Living with it is another. But Shaq wasn't listening. Not really. He remembered too well the nights when hunger gnawed at his belly like a wild animal. He remembered the teachers who looked right through him. the police who followed him around department stores like a shadow. He remembered his mother's desperate prayers, whispered into the dark when rent was overdue. He remembered what it felt like to believe, even for a second, that you weren't alone. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He wasn't trying to win applause. He just knew what it felt like to be unwanted. And he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, those kids had been waiting for someone like him. Over the next few weeks, Shaq worked in secret. Quiet visits to battered shelters, private meetings with social workers, anonymous donations that smoothed bureaucratic wheels. He found out their names, names heavy with stories no one had cared to hear. He learned about the foster homes that had shuffled them around like bad cards, the relatives who had shut doors and hearts, the silent, grinding racism that had stolen their futures before they could even spell the word. They weren't just poor. They were abandoned, failed by every system that was supposed to catch them before they fell. And still, when Shaq finally stood face to face with them, their eyes didn't ask for anything. They didn't beg. They didn't smile. They looked at him like they were daring him to care, daring him to prove he wasn't just another person who would pat them on the head and disappear. Shaq didn't make promises that day. He just listened. Listened to the space between their silences. Listened to the brittle anger wrapped around their words. Listened to the bone-deep exhaustion of kids who had carried too much for too long. And somewhere in the middle of all that brokenness, he made a decision. He would adopt them. Not just sponsor them. Not just tutor them. Not just photograph them next to a giant novelty check. He would bring them home. Give them his name. Give them the safety he wished he'd had at their age. The decision didn't land like fireworks. It was quieter than that. Quieter and heavier, like dropping an anchor in a storm. He knew the paperwork would be hell, knew the headlines would be merciless, knew some people would accuse him of grandstanding, or worse, failing. But he didn't care. Because in that moment, standing in a cracked parking lot that smelled like old oil and rain, Shaquille O'Neal understood something simple and brutal. You don't build a legacy by stacking trophies. You build it by stacking love. One tired, angry, beautiful kid at a time. And maybe, just maybe, by saving them, he might find a way to save himself. They weren't looking for a hero. They didn't even believe heroes were real anymore. If life had taught them anything, it was that hope was a luxury they couldn't afford, and promises were just lies with prettier wrapping. They had stopped waiting for someone to save them a long time ago. What kept them breathing wasn't dreams, it was survival. Pure and simple. First, there was Deshaun. 16 years old, but already carrying the weight of a man twice his age. His frame was tall, lean, hardened by years of hunger, and running from homes that called themselves shelters. His eyes were sharp, too sharp for someone who should have been worrying about SEAT scores in summer camp. Deshaun had been passed around so many foster homes that he stopped bothering to learn the names of the people who barely learned his. Every goodbye had been too easy for them. It taught him early that connections meant weakness. Love was a trick. Trust was a setup. He had built walls so high around himself that even he forgot what it felt like to feel anything real. Racism hadn't just scarred him. It had shaped him, taught him that some doors weren't just closed. They were slammed shut before he even got close. Then there was Lyric, 15, named by a mother who had believed once that her baby girl would sing her way out of the projects. Instead, life had muted her. Lyric moved through the world with a quietness that made people overlook her, which was just the way she liked it. Her beauty was the kind that made strangers stare too long, and predators look twice, and it had made her life a constant game of dodging the wrong kind of attention. She had learned to disappear in plain sight, to fold herself into corners, to smile when it was safe and vanish when it wasn't. Her foster record was a map of heartbreak, a history of homes that had promised protection and delivered pain instead. She didn't cry anymore. Crying didn't fix broken promises. It didn't erase the way people looked at her skin and decided she was disposable. Behind her was Zion, a boy of 13, who had been named after strength but spent most of his life feeling anything but. He was smaller than the others, quick with his words, quicker with his fists when cornered. Zion had been expelled from 2 schools before most kids his age even learned to open a locker. They called him trouble. They called him aggressive. They never called him scared, even though that's what he was. Deep down, scared of being invisible. Scared of being noticed for all the wrong reasons. Scared of becoming another statistic on the evening news. Another black boy shot down by life before he even had the chance to mess it up on his own. Zion knew about racism too. It wasn't just the big ugly acts, it was the small slights. The way store owners followed him. The way teachers ignored him. The way he never got picked even when he was twice as good. And then there was Amara, the baby of the group at just 10 years old. Her name meant grace, but the world had been anything but graceful to her. Her mother had vanished into addiction. Her father into prison walls that would never let him go. Amara had lived in 6 homes in the past 3 years, each colder than the last. She clutched a worn teddy bear like it was an anchor. Her fingers frayed the stuffing from its seams, but never let go. She didn't speak much anymore, not because she didn't have words, but because no one ever listened when she used them. Her silence wasn't emptiness, it was defense. It was armor. She had seen too much, understood too much for someone who still should have been worried about dolls and jump ropes. Life had taught her that love was a storybook fantasy, and fairy tales weren't written for girls like her. They weren't a family. They were a collection of fractures held together by proximity and circumstance. Deshawn barely spoke unless it was to warn them about the next threat around the corner. Lyric kept her eyes down and her back to the wall. Zion bounced between bravado and panic like a pendulum wound too tight. Amara trailed them like a ghost, small and silent and almost invisible. Their bond wasn't made of affection. It was forged from necessity. They stuck together because the world outside was colder, meaner, and less forgiving. In their own broken way, they were all each other had, even if they would never say it out loud. Trust didn't come easy. Trust could kill you. The day they crossed paths with Big Shaq wasn't the first time a stranger had stared at them. Usually they were used to it. The wary glances, the locked car doors, the quickened footsteps on sidewalks. They were used to being seen as a problem, a threat, something to avoid. But this time was different. This time the man in the tinted SUV didn't look away. He didn't speed up or shake his head or clutch his wallet tighter. He just watched them. Not like they were dangerous. Not like they were broken. Like they mattered. It unsettled Deshawn the most. He had trained himself to recognize threats immediately, and rich men in expensive cars were never a good sign. But this one didn't scream danger. He didn't scream anything. He just watched them like he saw something he recognized, something he couldn't turn away from. Lyric caught it too, and it twisted in her stomach, unfamiliar and uncomfortable. Hope was a dangerous thing. Hope got you killed. Hope made you soft, and softness got you crushed. Zion, reckless and impulsive as ever, flipped off the SUV just to see what would happen. The window stayed up. The car didn't move. It didn't even honk. Just sat there, a silent challenge. And Amara clutched her bear tighter and stared back, unblinking. She didn't understand what was happening, but her instincts told her not to look away. Not this time. After the SUV pulled away, the 4 of them argued. Deshawn said it didn't mean anything. Zion joked about rich guys feeling guilty. Lyric warned them not to get any ideas. Amara said nothing, but that night she curled up a little tighter around her bear, wondering if maybe, just maybe, someone out there had seen her. Their lives before that moment had been a brutal, relentless grind. Each of them carried scars that no one could see, scars that twisted the way they walked through the world. Racism wasn't just something that happened to them. It was stitched into the fabric of every interaction. It told them where they could go, how they could dress, how loud they could laugh, when they had to be invisible, and when they had to be silent. Every missed opportunity, every closed door, every sneer and suspicion, and sidelong glance. It stacked up, brick by brick, until it felt like they were living inside a fortress built by someone else's hate. Deshawn had learned that black boys his size were threats before they were human beings. Lyric had learned that black girls were seen as fast, as trouble, no matter how quietly they moved. Zion had learned that black boys who fought back were labeled violent, dangerous, criminal. And Amara, sweet, silent Amara, had learned that little black girls who cried were called dramatic, or worse, ignored entirely.
They weren't looking for a hero because heroes didn't exist in their world, only survivors. And even that was a shaky thing.
But fate, that cruel and twisting thing, wasn't done with them yet. It was winding something unseen in the background, setting up a collision they didn't know was coming. The SUV, the man inside it, the choices that would follow. It was all already in motion. They just didn't know it yet. For now, they clung to what they knew. Each other, the cracked sidewalks under their feet, the bitter certainty that they were alone. They weren't waiting to be rescued. They weren't dreaming of a better life. Dreams were for people who had the luxury of believing in tomorrow. They were just trying to survive today. And somewhere, in the swirling uncertainty of their broken world, Big Shaq was making plans that would change everything they thought they knew about family, about trust, about love. Because sometimes when you've given up on heroes, the universe sends you something better. It sends you someone real. Someone who sees the cracks and decides to build anyway. Someone who understands that saving a life isn't about swooping in with a cape. It's about staying when things get ugly. It's about fighting for people who have forgotten how to fight for themselves. And somewhere, deep down in places they didn't even know still existed, all four of those broken souls felt something stir. Not hope. Not yet. But something just as dangerous. A reason to want more. And soon they would have to decide whether to trust it or destroy it, before it destroyed them. Because when you've spent your whole life running, standing still can be the scariest thing in the world. And for the first time, they were about to find out what it meant to be wanted. Really truly wanted. And nothing would ever be the same again. It's easy to write checks. It's another thing to write your life into someone else's story. Big Shaq had always been generous, handing out scholarships, funding youth centers, covering hospital bills for strangers he'd never meet. But this wasn't another charity drive. This wasn't slapping a logo on a donation and posing for the camera. This was raw. This was messy. This was real life, tangled and imperfect. And for the first time, Shaq realized that loving broken people might just break him too. The first hurdle was legal. Nobody made it easy for a single black man, even one with millions to his name, to adopt 4 troubled kids from the system. The state had questions, lots of them, hidden behind polite, clipped tones and endless paperwork. They asked about his criminal record, clean. They asked about his financials, solid. They asked about his mental health, his family structure, his ability to handle high-risk youth. They buried judgment in their words. But Shaq heard it loud and clear. You're not who we expect. The unspoken question hovered over every meeting. Why would a man like him want kids like them? They dissected him under the pretense of caution. Psych evaluations, home studies, interviews that felt less like conversations and more like interrogations. They asked if he understood the challenges of adopting children from troubled backgrounds, as if trauma was something he could read about in a brochure. They asked if he had experience with behavioral disorders, emotional disturbances, attachment issues. They asked if he was prepared for the consequences, when love wasn't enough to fix the damage. Shaq answered their questions one by one, steady and unwavering. But inside, doubt clawed at him. It whispered in his ears. At night when the house creaked and groaned, it wormed its way into his chest when he sat alone at his kitchen island, flipping through profiles that reduced lives to bullet points. Aggressive tendencies, history of neglect, difficulty forming trust. There were moments he almost believed them. Moments when he wondered if love really was enough. If he was enough, he could still back out. He could write another check, sponsor another program, move on with his easy, polished life. Nobody would blame him. But then he would remember Deshaun's guarded eyes, Lyric's hollow smile, Zion's restless anger, Amara's heartbreaking silence. He would remember how they didn't ask for him, how they didn't believe in heroes, how they sat on that cracked curb daring the world to prove them wrong. Shaq realized then that adoption wasn't about saving them. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about showing up. Every day, without guarantee, without applause, without any promise it would work. It was about choosing them. Again and again, even when they pushed him away. The legal hurdles were only the beginning. The judgment came next. Not from strangers. Strangers didn't matter. It came from people he trusted. Friends. Advisors. Even family. They warned him in private conversations cloaked as concern. You're a good man, Shaq, but you don't know what you're getting into. They said. They'll resent you. You can't fix them. You'll tear yourself apart trying. They come from trauma. They'll drag you down with them. They'll never love you like you love them. At first, Shaq tried to argue. He laid out his plans, his intentions, the resources he was willing to pour into therapy, education, stability. He explained that he understood it. Wouldn't be easy. But it didn't seem to matter. No one believed he could do it. And worse, some didn't believe those kids deserved it. The racism was quieter now, but it was still there, pulsing underneath the words. The implication that 4 black kids from the system were too broken to save. That even Big Shaq's money, fame and influence couldn't scrub them clean enough to fit into the polished world he occupied. Shaq heard it, and it made his blood boil. He thought about his own life, about the coaches who had written him off as just another big dumb black kid before they saw his stats, about the reporters who called him articulate like it was a surprise, about the moments when no matter how many millions he made, how many businesses he built, how many degrees he earned, he still felt like he was being weighed against a standard he was never meant to reach. He knew what it felt like to be seen as less. He wasn't about to let those kids feel it too. Not if he could help it. The process dragged on for months. Court dates, psychological evaluations, home inspections so invasive. Shaq joked bitterly to himself that maybe they should just install security cameras in his shower to be sure. He attended parenting classes full of nervous couples with baby bumps and adoption dreams, sitting awkwardly in tiny chairs designed for much smaller men. He filled out forms that asked him about discipline philosophies, bedtime routines, dietary plans. Forms that asked if he would love children even if they didn't love him back. Forms that asked if he was prepared for rejection, rebellion, resentment. Every form, every question, every hoop he jumped through was another chance to say no. He said yes, again and again and again. Through every moment of self-doubt, every second guess from others, every sleepless night spent wondering if he was making a mistake that would ruin not just his life but theirs too. He said yes. Because at the end of the day, Shaq understood something that the system didn't. Those kids weren't charity cases. They weren't liabilities, they weren't lost causes. They were human beings who had been thrown away too many times already, and all they needed, what they deserved, was someone willing to stay. When the final court date came, Shaq sat in a stiff-backed chair that barely contained his frame, wearing a tailored suit that felt tighter than any jersey ever had. Across from him, the kids sat in their best clothes, awkward and stiff, like they were bracing for another disappointment. The judge, an older woman with kind but tired eyes, reviewed the paperwork, the reports, the recommendations. There was a long pause, one that stretched so tightly Shaq could hear the tension crackling in the air. Then, softly, she said the words that changed everything. Petition for adoption granted. The gavel struck once, sharp and final. It should have felt triumphant. A victory. But Shaq didn't feel victorious. He felt humbled, terrified, honored. Every emotion crashed into him at once. So heavy he had to clench his fists against his knees to stay grounded. The kids didn't jump up and cheer. They didn't run into his arms. They didn't cry happy tears. They sat there, stunned, like the floor had shifted beneath them, and they didn't know if it would hold. Shaq didn't push. He knew better. Love wasn't a moment. It was a lifetime. It was 1,000 small yeses, whispered in the dark. It was showing up the next morning and the one after that. And the one after that. It was staying when it got hard. It was choosing them over and over, until maybe someday they believed it too. As they left the courtroom, Shaq didn't walk ahead. He didn't lead. He matched their pace, slow and cautious, giving them room to decide if they wanted to walk beside him. One step at a time. That night, the house didn't feel so empty. It wasn't filled with laughter yet, or warmth, but it was filled with something else. Potential. The quiet, trembling heartbeat of something beginning. Shaq moved through the kitchen, the living room, the hallways, seeing it all through new eyes. The grandeur didn't matter anymore. The trophies, the medals, the multi-million-dollar contracts, they were just background noise. What mattered was the 4 bedrooms that were no longer just spare spaces. What mattered was the sound of hesitant footsteps upstairs, drawers opening, closets filling with worn clothes that didn't yet smell like home. What mattered was the flicker of something fragile and beautiful beginning to take root in the cracks of their brokenness. Family. Not perfect. Not easy. But real. And Shaq, for all his strength, all his fame, all his towering presence, understood one thing more clearly than ever before. The hardest yes he ever said wasn't to the NBA, or to the brands begging for his face on their billboards, or to the investors lining up to fund his ventures. It was to 4 kids who didn't believe in heroes anymore. 4 kids who had every reason not to trust. 4 kids who would test him, push him, hurt him, and maybe if he was lucky, let him love them anyway. It was the yes that would cost him more than anything he'd ever bought. And it was the only yes that mattered, even when they tried to make him leave. Because love wasn't pretty speeches and hallmark moments. Love was messy. It was furious. It was stubborn and ugly and raw. Love wasn't saying, "I'm here" when things were good. It was saying, "I'm here" when everything fell apart. One night, after an especially brutal shouting match between Deshaun and Zion, over a borrowed jacket, Shaq sat alone on the back porch, staring up at the stars. His chest ached with exhaustion, his mind replaying every ugly word, every slammed door, every moment he wondered if he had made a mistake. He thought about his own childhood again, the nights when his mother cried behind closed doors, the days when he was too hungry to focus, too angry to care. He thought about the coaches who gave up on him, the teachers who saw a statistic, not a student, the neighbors who crossed the street when they saw him coming. And he realized something with bone-deep certainty. Healing wasn't supposed to be easy. Healing hurt, because it meant digging up the rot, exposing the wounds, peeling back the scabs before they could truly scar over. It meant facing everything you wanted to bury, and still choosing to move forward. Shaq wasn't naive. He didn't expect gratitude. He didn't expect forgiveness. He didn't even expect love. He only hoped, someday, they would believe they deserved to be loved. That they were more than the sum of their scars. That they didn't have to carry their pain alone. And maybe, just maybe, when the walls finally came down, they could build something better together. Not perfect. Not painless. But real. The kind of family that survived the storms. Not because it never got hit, but because it refused to break. As Shaq sat there under the wide, indifferent sky, the back door creaked open behind him. Small footsteps shuffled across the porch. A tiny body leaned against his side, silent but solid. Amara. He didn't say anything. He didn't move. After a long moment, a second set of footsteps, then a third, then a fourth. Deshaun, Zion, and Lyric. No apology. No dramatic hugs. Just presence. Just four broken souls, choosing, however cautiously, to be near him. Shaq closed his eyes, feeling the rough weight of them settle against him like a promise. Healing hurt more than being broken. But for the first time, it didn't feel impossible. It felt like the beginning of something worth fighting for. And Big Shaq had never been afraid of a fight that mattered. No matter how high you climb, some people will only ever see the color of your skin. For a little while it felt like they might be winning. Shaq's home, once filled with tension and walls too high to scale, had started breathing easier. The kids laughed sometimes, real laughs that echoed against the high ceilings and softened the cold, hard edges of the mansion. They fought less. They sat closer. They asked questions, told jokes, left fingerprints on the glossy counters, without fear of being scolded. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Healing had begun, slow and uneven like spring thawing a frozen world. Shaq knew better than to trust it completely. The world outside didn't change just because you built a safe place inside. But even he, with all his battle scars and hard-earned wisdom, wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could live beyond the reach of the ugliness waiting beyond their gates. It happened on a Saturday, bright and warm, the kind of day that begged for celebration. Shaq decided to take the kids out, make a memory, stamp a good day into their growing collection of second chances. They chose the new water park just outside the city, a place buzzing with families, music, food stands, and the wild, infectious laughter of children running loose under a hot sun. Shaq kept it low-key, no entourage, no flashy cars, just a black Escalade, and his baseball cap pulled low. He wanted them to feel normal, to blend, to forget, for just one day, the weight they carried on their shoulders. For a few hours it worked. They raced down slides, battled under spraying fountains, dared each other to leap from dizzying heights into cool blue pools. Zion finally cracked a genuine smile as he cannonballed into a wave pool, soaking a shrieking Lyric and a scowling Deshaun. Even Amara, cautious and reserved, let out a thin, precious giggle as she floated in a giant inner tube beside Shaq. It almost felt easy. Until it didn't. It started at the snack stand. Deshaun, Lyric, Zion, and Amara lined up to grab slushies while Shaq waited at a nearby bench, towel draped over his shoulders, a proud grin sneaking across his face. He watched them, still rough around the edges, but lighter than he had ever seen them. That's when two security guards started circling the kids. At first, Shaq thought he was being paranoid. Years of living under the constant threat of being misunderstood had conditioned him to look for trouble where there wasn't any. But no, it wasn't paranoia this time. The guards weren't casual. They weren't subtle. They hovered, stiff-backed and tight-lipped, whispering into radios and eyeing the kids like they were about to steal something. Shaq stood up, heart thudding a slow, angry beat against his ribs. He moved closer, keeping himself steady, calm, aware that a wrong move could turn a bad situation worse in a blink. He caught the conversation just as it turned ugly. "Empty your pockets," one of the guards barked at Zion, who stiffened immediately, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "We didn't do anything," Lyric snapped, her voice sharp, high with panic. "Got a report about some shoplifting," the guard said, not even bothering to disguise the lie. His eyes slid over their brown skin, their cheap swim trunks, the Foster labels they couldn't peel off no matter how far they ran. "We paid," Deshaun said, voice low, dangerous in its restraint. Shaq stepped in then, massive and unmistakable, his presence swallowing the small stand whole. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, voice measured but carrying the kind of authority that made grown men think twice. The guards hesitated, thrown off for half a second by the sudden arrival of a 6'7" giant who looked like he could bench press them both without breaking a sweat. Then one of them sneered, a slow curl of the lip that said everything. "You with them?" Shaq nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Yeah, I'm with them." The guard shrugged, trying to save face. "Just doing our job, sir. Had some complaints." "You know how it is." Shaq knew exactly how it was. He had lived how it was. He saw it in the way people tightened their grip on their children when he walked by. He saw it in the way cashiers double-checked $100 bills he handed over, even when his face was plastered across national television. He saw it every time someone smiled too wide, laughed too loud, tried too hard to act like they didn't see color when every move they made said otherwise. He saw it now, in the way 4 black kids couldn't even buy a slushie without being treated like criminals. A small crowd had started to gather, drawn by the commotion. Phones came out, recording silently, hungry for the next viral moment. Shaq knew how fast things could spiral, how even innocence could be twisted under the right or wrong lens. He wrapped one massive arm around Deshaun's shoulders, steering him gently but firmly away. Another around Zion. He nodded to Lyric and Amira, who moved like shadows, eyes wide, faces pale with rage and humiliation. They didn't fight, not because they agreed, but because they had learned long ago that fighting back often made things worse. Back at the car, the silence was brutal, hot, suffocating. Amira climbed into the back without a word, curling into a ball against the door. Zion kicked the tire so hard the SUV rocked on its suspension, then slid into his seat, vibrating with suppressed anger. Lyric wiped at her eyes with the heels of her hands, furious at herself for letting them see her cry. Deshaun stared out the window, jaw clenched so tightly, Shaq thought he might break his own teeth. Shaq sat behind the wheel, hands gripping the leather so hard it creaked. He wanted to tear something apart. He wanted to go back and demand justice, demand apologies, demand the world see his kids for what they were. Beautiful, wounded, fierce, and worthy. But he knew better. The world didn't apologize for its ugliness, and black children didn't get second chances. They barely got first ones. As he drove, the kids muttered conversations twisted in the heavy air. "They'll never see us as anything but trouble," Zion said, voice flat and bitter. "Doesn't matter what we do," Lyric added. "Doesn't matter if we're good. Doesn't matter if we're rich. We're still them to people like that." Shaq didn't correct them, because they were right, and that truth tasted like acid on his tongue. When they got home, nobody rushed to their rooms. Nobody turned on the television, or laughed, or even spoke. They just drifted through the massive house like ghosts. Like all the light they had found over the past few months had been sucked out in an instant. Shaq sat on the front steps, head in his hands. He had built them a castle, but the world had reminded them the moat wasn't wide enough. Hours later, when the house had settled into uneasy silence, Shaq gathered them in the living room. No grand speeches, no promises he couldn't keep. He looked at each of them, their faces battered by a reality they had fought so hard to outrun, and he said the only thing he could. "I see you." He didn't try to sugarcoat it, didn't try to spin the story into a lesson about perseverance or strength. They didn't need cliches, they needed truth. "I see you," he repeated. "I see who you are, and no one, not security guards, not strangers, not this world is ever going to make me see you any differently." It wasn't enough to fix it. It wasn't enough to heal the cracks splintered wider today. But it was something. And sometimes when the world knocked you down and laughed while you bled, having someone reach down without flinching mattered more than anything else. That night the kids didn't say much. They didn't need to. When Shaq walked upstairs hours later, he found Zion's door cracked open. A silent invitation. He found Deshaun's sneakers abandoned by the couch. A silent admission that he wasn't running tonight. He found Lyric's sketchbook left on the coffee table. An unfinished drawing of 4 figures standing shoulder to shoulder. And he found Amara asleep at the foot of the stairs, curled up with her battered teddy bear, as if guarding the entrance against all the ugliness outside. Shaq lifted her carefully, carried her upstairs, and tucked her in, without waking her. The world had reminded them today that they didn't belong. But tomorrow and every day after, he would remind them that they did. Because belonging wasn't given. It was built. And Big Shaq was just getting started. One morning, Shaq found her bed empty, her window slightly ajar, a letter on the nightstand. It wasn't bitter. It wasn't angry. It simply said she needed to find herself before the world finished telling her who she wasn't. Shaq sat on her bed for a long time, the letter crumpled in his massive hand, grief swallowing him whole. The house was empty now. The laughter, the shouting, the arguments over who got the last slice of pizza. It was all gone. Only echoes remained. Shaq moved through the mansion like a ghost, each room a graveyard of memories he couldn't stop revisiting. He left their rooms untouched. Zion's sneakers, Deshaun's letter, Lyric's abandoned notebook, Amara's teddy bear still sitting upright against her pillow like it was waiting for her to come home. He went to work. He showed up for commitments. He smiled for cameras when he had to. But something vital had cracked inside him. It wasn't just loss. It was failure. Because he had promised to stay. And somehow, despite all the promises, he hadn't been enough to make them stay too. The public noticed. Rumors started swirling. Whispers in the media. Anonymous sources hinting at trouble, at rebellion, at Shaq losing control of the family he had tried to build. He ignored them. He wasn't angry at the kids. How could he be? They had only done what they had been trained by life to do. Run before they got left behind. He had just been foolish enough to believe he could outrun their ghosts. Sometimes at night, when the house groaned against the wind, Shaq would sit in the kids' old rooms, trying to breathe in whatever pieces of them still lingered in the walls. He wasn't angry. He was just broken. Not in a way anyone could see, but in a way that hollowed him out from the inside. And somewhere deep inside, a voice he tried to silence kept asking, had he saved them? Or had he just given them one more thing to lose? Sometimes when hearts break, they don't shatter. They dissolve, bit by bit, until you're left holding handfuls of dust, wondering how something that once felt so real could vanish so completely. Shaq still left the porch light on every night. Still kept the pantry stocked with their favorite snacks. Still kept 4 keys on the hook by the door. Because somewhere, deep down, in the places too scarred to touch, he wasn't ready to believe they were truly gone. He wasn't ready to stop waiting. Because love doesn't end when the people you love walk away. It lingers, it hopes, it aches. And sometimes when you've given someone a piece of your soul, you don't get it back just because they leave. You keep waiting. You keep hurting. Because even giants can break. And Big Shaq had never been more human than he was now. The mansions echoed with everything they didn't say. Once, the house had vibrated with life. Shouts from upstairs, slammed doors, the occasional thud of footsteps racing down the grand staircases. Now silence crept through the hallways like a slow-moving fog, curling into every corner, heavy and cold. Shaq moved through it like a ghost, a giant out of place in a kingdom built for laughter that never came back. At first he kept waiting for the noise to return. Some nights he would leave the television on, letting old sitcoms fill the empty spaces with canned laughter and forced cheer. Other nights he sat on the front porch, long after the sun dipped behind the hills, hoping to see headlights sweep up the long driveway, hoping for the creak of the front door, the shuffle of hesitant footsteps, hoping for a sign that they remembered him, that they missed him, that they wanted to come back. The world outside the gates moved on without him. Seasons shifted. Friends drifted. Business deals came and went. Shaq smiled on camera, made appearances at charity events, laughed at interviews. But behind the scenes the weight pressed heavier every day. Every trophy, every framed photo, every plaque honoring his contributions, felt hollow without the only thing that had ever made it all matter, them. He kept their rooms, exactly the same. Deshaun's sneakers still sat by the window, scuffed and worn from pickup games he never came home to finish. Zion's headphones tangled on his nightstand. The cords stretched from one restless night of music, meant to drown out the world. Lyrics notebooks, pages filled with poems she never shared, gathered dust in the drawer. Shaq couldn't bring himself to close. Amara's teddy bear remained perched on her neatly made bed, its fabric fraying with every month that passed without her tiny arms wrapped around it. The staff whispered about it. They tried to help at first, offering to clean the rooms, to freshen things up. Shaq refused. It wasn't about the mess. It was about the memory. If he let them scrub away the traces of his children, it would feel too much like admitting they were never coming back. Loneliness settled into his bones, like a second skin. It wasn't the loud, dramatic kind people expected. It was quieter, meaner. It gnawed at him during the long, empty afternoons, and hollowed him out during the silent nights. He slept less, ate less, smiled less. The depression wasn't sudden. It seeped in slowly, so subtly he barely noticed it taking hold. He started missing meetings, canceling appearances, avoiding friends. He retreated into the massive house like a wounded animal, licking wounds no one could see. The whispers started then, outside the mansion walls. He tried. He failed. Big Shaq, the man who could do anything, couldn't even hold on to his own family. It wasn't said with cruelty, not outright. It was murmured with pity, the kind that cuts deeper than hate. They said he was naive, that he had bitten off more than he could chew. Some accused him of adopting the kids for publicity. Others said he had no business trying to raise children from backgrounds he couldn't understand, no matter how big his heart was. The worst part was, Shaq heard those voices even in his own head. Every time he walked past their empty rooms, every time he sat alone at a table set for 6 and ate in silence, every time he looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back, the guilt was relentless. He replayed every decision, every word, every missed opportunity. He wondered if he had pushed too hard, or not enough, if he had tried to fix them instead of just loving them. If his home, no matter how large and warm, had still felt like a cage. He wondered if he had been selfish, trying to heal his own wounds through them without understanding the cost. He wondered if they hated him now. The depression settled deeper. Shaq stopped answering his phone. Invitations piled up unread. He stopped posting on social media, stopped engaging with the world that once demanded so much from him. Fans noticed, commentators speculated. Rumors swirled about health issues, secret scandals, financial troubles. No one guessed the truth. The truth was, Big Shaq, the man who had once filled arenas with his presence, could barely fill his own chest with enough air to get through the day. He started taking long drives late at night, winding through the forgotten neighborhoods he had grown up in. Sometimes he parked outside old playgrounds, watching swings creak in the wind. Sometimes he walked crumbling sidewalks, unnoticed, just another tall, sad figure lost in the dark. He avoided the water park, couldn't bear to drive past the place that had cracked something essential inside all of them. He avoided the schools, the courts, the churches, anywhere that might remind him of what he had lost. He even avoided the basketball courts he had once lived on, the thud of the ball against concrete, a cruel echo of the family games that would never happen again. Years slipped by like that. Silent, heavy, merciless. And still, a part of him refused to give up hope. A stubborn, foolish part of him kept believing that one day, maybe, he would hear a knock on the door. Maybe a voice would call out from the driveway. Maybe a letter would arrive, saying, "I'm ready, I'm coming home." But the only letters he received were bills, fan mail, and business offers. The only knocks came from delivery drivers and maintenance crews. The only voices belonged to strangers who didn't know him, not really. The public moved on. They found new heroes to praise and tear down, new stories to devour. Shaq was relegated to a cautionary tale, a man who had once been larger than life, now reduced to silence. And still the house stood, waiting like he was. There were small moments that almost shattered him. Seeing a group of teenagers laughing in a mall, catching a glimpse of a girl with braids like Amara's, disappearing into a crowd, hearing a song lyric used to hum under her breath, come on the radio, when he least expected it. He learned to hide the tears when they came, learned to swallow the grief so deep it felt like a second heartbeat. He built routines around the emptiness. Morning walks, charity work, quiet dinners cooked by his own hands, because he couldn't bear the thought of someone else preparing meals they would never eat. He talked to them sometimes, late at night, sitting in the darkened living room, not expecting answers, just needing to say the words out loud. "I'm still here. I'm sorry. I love you." The mansion echoed back nothing but silence. Sometimes he thought about selling it all, burning it down to the studs, and starting over somewhere new. But he couldn't, because if he left, how would they find him if they ever decided to come back? He needed to be where they left him, just in case. Shaq wasn't a fool. He knew the odds. He knew most kids who aged out of trauma didn't come back to the places that reminded them of their pain. He knew the world was cruel, that life scattered people like seeds in the wind. But hope, that stubborn thing, clung to him anyway. Not the bright, easy hope of fairy tales. The ragged, battered hope of a man who had lost everything that mattered and still chose to believe. The hope of a father, because that's what he was. No matter how far they ran, no matter how long they stayed away, no matter how much it broke him, he was their father, and he would wait. For as long as it took, for as long as he could draw breath, because love doesn't quit. Not real love. Not the kind you carve out of your own bones to give to someone else. Not the kind that survives even when there's no one left to see it. The silent years were long, and they were brutal. But Big Shaq endured them the only way he knew how. One empty day at a time. One hollow night after another. One prayer whispered into the void. Waiting. Always waiting. Because sometimes the greatest acts of love aren't the ones that change the world in a blaze of glory. Sometimes they're the ones where you simply refuse to give up on someone. The ones you love never really leave. Sometimes they just come back differently. Shaq had stopped counting how many seasons passed. The world outside changed in small ways. The neighborhood grew busier. Buildings rose where old fields once stood. New families moved into the silent spaces, once reserved for those who remembered. But inside Shaq's mansion, time froze. He kept the porch light burning. He kept the doors unlocked. He kept their rooms untouched. A stubborn shrine to a love that refused to die. He had almost made peace with it. That they were gone. That whatever small part he had played in their lives was just a brief, painful chapter they had outgrown. He didn't expect a reunion. He didn't expect redemption. He didn't expect anything anymore. And then one cold autumn evening, the letter came. It arrived without warning, tucked between bills and advertisements. A simple white envelope with no return address. Shaq almost threw it out, but something about the careful handwriting stopped him. He opened it with thick, uncertain fingers, heart pounding in a way he hadn't felt in years. Inside, just a few lines. Thank you for not giving up on me when I couldn't stay. I'm coming home. Lyric. Shaq read the words over and over, not trusting his eyes. He turned the letter over, searching for more, an address, a phone number, a date. Nothing. It didn't matter. She was alive. She remembered. She was coming back. For the first time in years, Shaq let the tears fall freely. Unashamed. Days passed, stretching painfully thin. Every knock at the door, every car that slowed near the driveway, made his heart lurch with wild, desperate hope. Weeks dragged by with no sign of her. He told himself not to expect too much. People changed. Promises faded. And then, on a brisk Sunday morning, there she was. Lyric stood at the bottom of the driveway, framed by the rising sun. She was taller now, sharper around the edges, but her eyes were the same. Quiet storms, filled with things most people would never understand. She carried no bags, wore no makeup, made no show of her arrival. She just stood there, waiting. Shaq didn't run to her, didn't shout. He simply walked down the steps, slow and steady, heart hammering so hard he thought it might shatter his ribs. He stopped a few feet away, afraid that if he got too close she might vanish. Lyric smiled, small, tremulous, and whispered, "Hi, Dad." That was all it took. The walls between them crumbled in an instant. Shaq pulled her into a hug that swallowed her whole, and Lyric didn't resist. She clung to him, trembling against his chest, and for the first time in a long time, the mansion breathed again. Over coffee at the kitchen table, Lyric told her story. How college had been brutal and beautiful all at once. How she had fought to be seen as more than a statistic, more than a charity case. How she had graduated with honors. Gone on to start a non-profit that provided scholarships for foster kids. A tribute to the life Shaq had tried to give her. "I couldn't have done it if you hadn't taught me I was worth it," she said, voice cracking. Shaq could barely speak around the lump in his throat. Pride burned in his chest, fierce and wild. She stayed for a few days, helping him repaint the old rooms, planting new flowers in the neglected garden. And then, one evening, as they sat watching the sunset, Lyric pulled out her phone and said, "I think someone else wants to come home too." Before Shaq could process the words, headlights cut through the dusk. A beat-up old car rattled up the driveway, coughing smoke and hope into the twilight air. The door swung open, and Zion stepped out. Older, broader, a little more cautious, a little more weathered, but unmistakably Zion. He didn't run to Shaq. Zion had never been one for theatrics. Instead, he stood there for a long moment, one hand gripping the car door like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to stay. Shaq opened his arms.
It was enough.
Zion moved forward, clapping Shaq on the back with the awkward affection of someone still learning how to be soft. He smelled like engine oil and fresh sweat, the scent of a man who had built himself from the ground up. They sat around the kitchen table that night, Lyric and Zion trading stories, laughing about memories Shaq thought they had forgotten. Zion talked about his time in trade school, about how he had opened a garage that offered free repairs to single mothers and struggling families. "I got the idea from you," Zion said, grinning crookedly. "You always fixed everything." Shaq laughed, deep and loud, feeling pieces of himself sliding back into place. Days blurred into weeks. The house, once hollow, hummed with cautious joy. Then, one rainy evening, another knock at the door. Shaq opened it to find Deshaun standing there, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, water dripping from the brim of his baseball cap. He didn't say anything. Neither did Shaq. They didn't need to. Shaq just stepped aside, and Deshaun walked in, shedding years of anger with every step. Over late-night talks and early morning coffees, Deshaun confessed how he had struggled, how he had fallen, and gotten back up more times than he could count, how he had eventually found his way into social work, fighting for kids who looked like him, sounded like him, hurt like him. "You showed me what it meant to stay," Deshaun said one night, voice thick with emotion. "Even when you had every reason to leave." Shaq listened, heart swollen with pride and sorrow. No return address, no name, just a sketch of a teddy bear on one side, and a few words scribbled in familiar looping handwriting. "I'm coming soon. Save me a seat, eh?" Shaq stared at it for a long time, tracing the lines with his finger as if he could pull her closer through sheer willpower. And one bright spring morning, as flowers bloomed and the world seemed to hum with second chances, Amara appeared. She stood on the sidewalk, small and fierce, wearing an oversized hoodie and a backpack covered in patches. She looked different, older, tougher, but her eyes were the same, wide, searching. Shaq didn't hesitate. She had been traveling the world. She told him later, using her art to tell stories no one else wanted to hear. Murals on crumbling walls, installations in forgotten cities, paintings that spoke of loss, hope, rage, resilience. "I wanted to show people that broken things can be beautiful too," she whispered. Shaq understood. More than she would ever know. The house filled again. Not with the reckless noise of children, but with the rich layered sounds of grown souls coming home. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. They cooked meals together, burned toast and undercooked pasta, laughing until their sides hurt. They argued over movies, fought for the last slice of pizza, sat around the fire pit, telling stories of the years they had survived apart. And late at night, when the stars blinked down over the backyard, they sat in silence, heavy with gratitude and love. Shaq realized something then. Something he had never dared to hope. They hadn't come back broken. They had come back whole, different, stronger, wiser, each carrying scars they wore like badges, not chains. Each carrying lessons they had learned in the dark. Each carrying pieces of him, stitched into their very bones. They had become the gifts he never knew he was building. Proof that love, real love, doesn't die in silence. It grows. It waits. It endures. Shaq sat on the porch one evening, Lyric curled in a chair beside him, Zion tinkering with the grill, Deshaun arguing with Amara about music choices, and he felt it settle deep in his chest. Home. Not a building. Not a dream. Not a fantasy. But a living, breathing thing. Built brick by broken brick. Built through pain and forgiveness, and stubborn, relentless love. The ones you love never really leave. Sometimes they just take the long way home. And when they do, they bring pieces of the world with them. Pieces of hope, pieces of redemption, pieces of a future you dared not imagine. Shaq leaned back, smiling as the laughter rose around him. The ghosts had returned, not to haunt him, but to heal him. And maybe, just maybe, to teach him that sometimes, Broken hearts don't stay broken forever. Sometimes they just need time to find their way back home. They didn't come back for revenge. They came back for revolution. The world they had grown up in. The world that bruised them, broke them, made them feel small, was still very much alive, humming with the same quiet cruelty, hidden under progress and polite applause. But this time, they weren't powerless children. They weren't running anymore. They had names, voices, platforms that stretched far beyond the corners they once cowered in. And they had a plan. It started small, the way all revolutions do. A panel discussion at a community college, where Lyric spoke about growing up invisible in a system that only noticed you when you failed. A free mechanics class, Zion offered on weekends, for teenagers who had never been taught that building something with your hands could be an act of defiance. Deshaun hosted workshops in forgotten neighborhoods, teaching kids how to navigate a world designed to box them in, teaching them to fight with their minds, not their fists. Omara painted. She covered the sides of abandoned buildings with massive murals, black boys crowned with fire, black girls rising from oceans, fists not clenched in violence but open in defiant offering, art that screamed when words couldn't. Their stories caught fire before they even realized it was happening. Videos of Lyric's speeches went viral, her voice a blade cutting through complacency. Photos of Zion teaching young men how to rebuild engines with pride traveled through neighborhoods and news feeds alike. Amara's murals were photographed by tourists, praised by critics, but more importantly, they were understood by the people who had once felt invisible. What they built wasn't loud at first. It wasn't the kind of revolution that made headlines with broken glass and burning streets. It was slower, deeper, the kind of revolution that stitched itself into the fabric of everyday life until ignoring it became impossible. They spoke at town halls where people flinched at the truths they bared open. They lobbied for policy changes, facing down politicians who smiled tightly and shifted uncomfortably under the weight of their unrelenting truth. They created scholarships, built youth centers, offered therapy services where once there had only been prisons waiting like open mouths. They refused to be just another tragedy, another sob story America could wring its hands over before flipping the channel. They refused to be forgotten, and everywhere they went, they carried Shaq's lessons with them. Stay when it's hard, speak when it's dangerous, love when it's easier to hate. The media couldn't get enough of them at first. They were a story too good to resist. 4 kids rescued by a superstar, scattered by life, now reunited to change the world. Interview requests flooded in, offers for book deals, speaking engagements, reality shows. They turned down most of it. They didn't want to be famous. They wanted to be heard. At one event, a reporter leaned too hard into the savior narrative, painting Shaq as the white knight who had fixed them. Lyric shut it down with a single sentence, her voice slicing clean through the room. Shaq didn't save us. He stayed long enough for us to learn how to save ourselves. That clip alone was shared millions of times. People began to understand. This wasn't about one man rescuing 4 kids. It was about what happens when someone believes in you enough to let you build your own wings, even if you crash a few times before you learn how to fly. They faced backlash. Of course. They were called ungrateful, radicals, race baiters. Some said they should just be happy they had been given a second chance and stay quiet. They didn't, because the revolution they were building wasn't rooted in anger. It was rooted in love. Love for the children still trapped in systems built to crush them. Love for the neighborhoods left to rot under neglect and prejudice. Love for the dreams, still struggling to survive against odds so steep they might as well have been walls. They traveled the country, sometimes together, sometimes separately, planting seeds everywhere they went. Schools where Black history was no longer a footnote, but a foundation. Hospitals where Black patients received equal care without suspicion. Programs that helped kids learn coding, filmmaking, carpentry, journalism, not just basketball or rap, but every language the world spoke. They changed the conversations happening at dinner tables, boardrooms, Senate floors. They shook the foundations America was built on. The ones that said quietly, persistently, that not everyone deserved to rise. And at the center of it all was Shaq. Not standing in front, not leading the charge, but standing behind them, proud, silent, steady. The mansion that had once been a mausoleum to loss became something else, a headquarters, a safe place, a home base for the movement. There were meetings late into the night, blueprints of plans spread across the massive dining table, laughter and arguments and passionate debates that rattled the windows. Shaq often sat quietly in the corner, watching them work, marveling at the people they had become. They didn't need him anymore. And somehow, that was the greatest gift of all. One evening after a particularly heated strategy session about upcoming protests and legislative pushes, Amara found Shaq sitting out on the back porch, nursing a glass of lemonade. She dropped onto the step beside him, resting her head against his arm like she had when she was a child. "You know," she said quietly, "you built this too." Shaq shook his head. "All I did was stay." "Exactly," Amara whispered. "The revolution wasn't perfect. It faced setbacks, defeats, broken promises and political games, and the relentless grinding exhaustion of trying to move mountains with bare hands. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. Because for every win, every life changed, every mind opened, there were 1,000 more waiting. One day, a photo of them standing together in front of one of Amara's murals went viral. The four of them, arms linked, faces fierce and proud, and Shaq standing just behind them, hand on Deshaun's shoulder, pride radiating from his very bones. The caption was simple: "This is what staying looks like." The world took notice. Laws changed. Schools changed. Hearts changed. Not all at once. Not everywhere. But enough. Enough to know it mattered. Enough to know they mattered. And in the quiet moments when the cameras were gone, and the world wasn't watching, they still came home. They still sat around the fire pit, roasting marshmallows badly, and telling terrible jokes. They still teased Shaq about his snoring, his terrible fashion sense, his hopeless attempts at modern slang. They were still family. Not because they shared blood, but because they shared scars. They shared hope. They shared the kind of love that survives being broken and remade 1,000 times over. The kind of love that doesn't flinch when the world tries to crush it. The kind of love that brings empires to their knees. One evening, as Shaq sat watching the sunset paint the sky in bruised purples and fierce oranges, he realized something profound. He hadn't failed. He hadn't lost them. He had given them roots strong enough to survive the storms, and wings strong enough to fly through them. Big Shaq, the man who once thought he needed to save 4 broken kids, had instead planted 4 unstoppable forces into a broken world. And together they were doing what he had always hoped, but never dared believe was possible. They were changing it. Not with rage. Not with revenge. But with the relentless, breathtaking, earth-shaking power of love. And for the first time in a long, long time, Shaq leaned back, closed his eyes and let the world move around him. Because he knew it was in good hands. Their hands. The hands he had once held as they learned to trust. The hands he now watched as they rebuilt the world he had once feared, was beyond saving. The revolution was here, and it had their names written all over it. Big Shaq had spent his life giving away pieces of his heart. Now the world was giving it back. It didn't happen all at once. Not in the way fairy tales promise. It happened slowly, quietly, like rain soaking into dry earth. It happened in every thank you, whispered by a stranger. Every life touched by the work his kids, his family had done. It happened in the way people began to speak his name, not just with awe for his athletic achievements, but with reverence for something far greater. They called him a legend long before he ever thought he deserved it. They talked about the championships, the endorsements, the charisma that filled arenas and lit up televisions. But now, in the twilight of his life, a different story began to take shape. Not the story of a man who dominated courts, but the story of a man who refused to give up on broken people. A man who, when faced with the choice between comfort and compassion, chose to love even when it cost him everything. The world started to see it when the movement Lyric, Zion, Deshaun and Amara had built reached critical mass. No longer confined to small neighborhoods or sympathetic circles, their influence stretched across states, across borders, into the very veins of a country still struggling to live up to its promises. Their work became impossible to ignore. Cities once resigned to despair, now buzzed with change, sparked by their programs. Schools once content to leave history whitewashed, now carried books filled with names and faces that looked like theirs. Families once fractured by systems that chewed up children of color, now found hope, found help, found healing. It was impossible to tell their story without telling Shaq's. Every article, every documentary, every tearful speech given on stages around the country, wove his name into the fabric of a new America trying to heal itself. They spoke of him at rallies, not as a celebrity, but as a father who refused to let 4 forgotten kids disappear into the void. They spoke of him in classrooms, teaching students that greatness wasn't about rings or records, but about what you left behind when the noise faded. They spoke of him on television specials and news segments, their voices cracking with emotion as they recounted the man who stayed when it would have been easier to walk away. Shaq watched it all with a stunned kind of humility. He had never wanted attention for loving his kids. He had never seen it as something remarkable. It had been instinct, reflex, need. He had loved them because he couldn't not love them, because once you let someone carve their name onto your heart, it was there forever, whether they stayed or not. But now, standing at the edge of a stage overlooking a sea of faces, Shaq finally understood something he had never allowed himself to believe. He hadn't failed. He hadn't lost them. He had planted seeds that had grown into forests strong enough to change the winds. The event was supposed to be a simple dedication ceremony. The city had renamed a community center in his honor, a sprawling, state-of-the-art facility designed to serve foster youth, struggling families, and underprivileged communities. But when Shaq arrived, he realized something much bigger was unfolding. The streets were packed, shoulder to shoulder, with people who had traveled from across the country. Handmade signs waved in the air. "Thank you, Big Shaq. You saved my brother. Because of you, I believe." The mayor gave a speech. Celebrities sent video messages. Old teammates showed up, grinning and clapping him on the back. But Shaq barely heard any of it. He only heard them. His kids. Standing together on the stage, looking every inch the leaders they had become. They spoke one by one, their voices carrying over the roaring crowd. Lyric talked about the nights she had almost given up. The nights when remembering Shaq's stubborn love was the only thing that kept her moving forward. Zion talked about how Shaq had taught him to build, not destroy, even when the world begged him to do the opposite. Deshaun talked about how Shaq's refusal to give up on him made him believe he was worth fighting for. Amara talked about how every brushstroke she laid on a wall, every mural she painted across crumbling cities, was a love letter to the man who gave her a reason to dream. They spoke until there wasn't a dry eye left. And when they finished, they turned to him. 4 adults. 4 miracles. 4 undeniable proofs that love, even when battered and tested and doubted, never dies. Lyric stepped forward first, holding something small and battered in her hands. Shaq recognized it immediately. Amara's teddy bear. The same one she had clutched when she first came to live with him. The same one that had sat waiting on her bed all those silent years. She placed it in his hands, and for a moment, Shaq couldn't breathe. "This," she said, her voice trembling, "is proof that you saved us, that you taught us how to save others." The crowd fell away. The noise fell away. All that remained was the weight of that bear in his hands, and the overwhelming, shattering realization that he hadn't just changed their lives. He had changed the world. Big Shaq, the giant who had once towered over courts and cameras, who had once filled stadiums with thunderous applause, now stood with tears streaming down his face. Utterly undone by the quiet, immeasurable power of love returned. They gathered around him then, his kids, his family, wrapping him in an embrace so tight it felt like the world itself was trying to hold him together. And for once he didn't fight the tears. He let them fall. Because giants cry too, especially when they realize the battles they thought they lost were victories waiting for the right season to bloom. Later, after the speeches ended and the crowd dispersed, they sat together under the stars, just like they used to. No cameras, no microphones, just family. Zion tossed a football lazily through the air. Lyric hummed an old song. Deshaun teased Amara about her terrible cooking. Amara threw a crumpled napkin at his head. Shaq leaned back in his chair, watching them, feeling something settle deep in his chest. Peace. Real peace. Not the kind that comes from pretending everything's fine. The kind that comes from knowing you did the hard thing, the right thing, even when it broke you open. "You know," Lyric said, nudging him with her shoulder, "we're not done yet." "Not even close," Zion added, grinning. "There's still a lot of world left to fix." Deshaun agreed. Amara smiled softly. "And you're stuck with us now." Shaq chuckled, low and deep. Wasn't planning on going anywhere. They laughed. And for a moment, it felt like they were all kids again, safe and stupid and free. But they weren't kids anymore. They were warriors. They were builders. They were proof. Shaq looked up at the sky, at the endless stretch of stars, and he thought about all the pieces of his heart he had given away over the years. He realized something beautiful. He hadn't lost them. They had multiplied. They had carried pieces of him into the world, and built cathedrals of hope, where once there had been only ruins. He closed his eyes, letting the laughter wash over him, letting the tears slip down his cheeks unchecked. Big Shaq, the man who had once thought trophies were the measure of greatness, now knew the truth. Greatness isn't what you win. It's what you leave behind. And he, flawed and stubborn and broken and fierce, had left behind a revolution made of love. The world would never be the same. Because sometimes, the greatest giants don't conquer. They nurture. They wait. They love. And in doing so, they build kingdoms that even time cannot tear down. As the fire crackled low and the stars blinked lazily overhead, Shaq smiled. Heart full, soul healed, home at last. The tears of a giant had watered something extraordinary, and the world would be blooming for generations to come.